Hi, I'm Cicely. I'm a 1L, and I was a kind of late applicant. And by late, I mean I applied around Christmas in January instead of October 1st or whenever a lot of the applications opened. I just wanted to give my experience and just the things that I wish I knew this time last year. I've got about 7 points that I've thought of over the past couple of months, and I do promise that my last point is very specifically about if I feel like my application date affected any of my applications, which I can't tell you for sure because I am not the dean of admissions of any law school. I am just here. So, the first thing I wish I would have known is that I would get in somewhere. I have, of course, like everyone, seen the horror stories of someone on Reddit or back in the day, top law schools, where they would say, I didn't get in anywhere, or I only got into one school and it was, just my safety school. And those are pretty few and far in between. And to be honest, you never know really what happened with someone's application. Yes, a lot of people will say I did everything, if not perfectly, because there's no such thing as a perfect application. I did everything as well as possible. I, crossed my T's and dotted my I's, did all the double checking that I should have. But, as far as we know, they may have just like dropped the F bomb in their personal statement in a really not effective way. So you never know. But going into this, you always think that you will be the exception and that you will not get in somehow, or like that you'll have made a mistake with all of your applications in some way, or just do something and only get into like a couple of schools or not get into any school that you want to. For me, this was especially true because having worked for a number of years out of undergrad, really wanting to go to law school this year, I still had this, not an issue exactly, but I was coming from a really good job that was paying me well, that I liked, and I was getting, still getting promoted and seeing growth, being given opportunities. So to me, it was really important to only go to law school if it would have a real positive benefit, if I would get a return on my investment. And that meant being really picky about the schools I chose. So I would say that I didn't apply to any safety schools, and that's not recommended. But if you really want to be a lawyer and you want to stay in your region and you want to do all of these things that you just kind of need the law degree for, I'm not going to say you shouldn't apply to safety schools, but for me and for a lot of people, it just doesn't make sense to apply to schools that you're not going to go to. So I only applied to top 20 schools, and I felt like I was so behind when I submitted my first applications, especially submitting my last applications. And I was really lucky to have kind of like a priority application with Duke. And so that meant that once I finally got the application in, I would know pretty quickly. But it was also one of the later applications I submitted. So I had already submitted some in December, right around Christmas. And I heard back from one of them in mid January before I even heard back from Duke, which is the school I expected to hear back from first. And I knew that that first answer would set the tone. And so I was hoping that it would be good news because it would give me a feel for how my application would do. Luckily, that first application and Duke, which came a few days later, were both acceptances. And so I even more so finally had a feel for it. But the beginning of January, I really worried. So the next thing, which is a lot quicker of a lesson that I learned, is that rejection may not actually hurt. Of course, it never feels good, but by the time I got my first rejection, I had gotten into two schools, or maybe even more than two schools, that I would have been happy to go to. Because, like I said, I only applied to schools that I would definitely go to, and they were all top 20 schools. So by the time I got that first rejection, I just felt like, well, it wasn't meant to be for me. And I know that rejection can hurt a lot, especially if it's your absolute dream school. But barring that, it might be just like a tiny twinge in the moment that you find out, but you kind of let it go and you move on with the choices that you have. The third thing is that the wait means absolutely nothing. Each of these offices work at their own pace and they have different metrics that they're looking at, and some of them weigh them differently. I assume you will hear and see that some years people are made to wait for months and months and months and they get in at the end, or you will hear people who get rejections immediately, people who wait months and months and months to get a rejection or a wait list. And so it's just all of this back office things that we don't know. With all of this, especially since Stanford, from what I can tell, has been pretty behind again this year in comparison to other schools. And like, I think a lot of schools are behind just because of the way this year is turning out. My last acceptance turned out to be my best and most important. I had great schools that I was very happy to go to, but in the end, my first choice chose me back. And it wasn't on a wait list. It was actually with the wave of a lot of people because they'd been busy, they were behind. And hearing back in December or January or February or March or April, which is when I finally heard back, I still felt just as valued. And I was happy that they'd taken their time and seen me. Okay, so on to the fourth, and that is all about fit. I think that the people who put their information out there, especially in like these recaps, there are a lot of really high achievers on these places, but it does mean that sometimes we see a lot of people who have really good outcomes mixed in with people who match expectations. And I think there's a lot of expectations set on that, these top three. If you get into Yale, you're going to get into all of them. If you get into Harvard, your chances of getting into Yale and Stanford are super high, and Stanford and, just whatever combination. And that's just not true. Just in looking pretty closely at the numbers and also talking with people, so much of this is about fit. People are pretty open, if not about their numbers, and about a lot of their outcomes. And I say this knowing people who I interned at the White House with, or who I worked with, or who have Truman scholarships and Rhodes scholarships and Marshall scholarships. And like, so people that you feel like are a shoe-in for wherever they apply, who get rejected from Harvard, get waitlisted at Yale, get into Stanford, get into Yale, get waitlisted at Stanford, get into Harvard. It's so much about fit, and admissions really does know what they're doing. Number five is not something I can prove, but something that I feel like I'll talk about in the future. I think financial aid is collusion, and like I said, can't prove it, but I got in up and down the top 20. My financial aid packages were pretty similar at most schools, including involving schools like Yale and Harvard and Stanford don't give merit aid, they just give need based. So I could see how that could change, but even comparing that kind of package to the merit based packages, pretty much the same thing. So it was going to cost me just as much to go, to a T20 school as to an HYS school. That's honestly probably because they know that they're competing against each other. So they kind of keep it pretty even. And that's why you can go to Berkeley and say, Duke gave me this, or Northwestern gave me this. So it's something that we know, but it really feels true from this perspective. The sixth point I want to make is that this choice, or all of the choices for law school applications, where to apply, when to apply, how many places to apply to, and eventually where you actually choose to go, it seems like something that you've been working up towards for probably forever. I know I started looking at top law schools in undergrad, and that was so far away from when I actually applied, but it's actually just the first choice of a lot of choices. And it seems like when you're in the middle of trying to make that decision, one choice can change your entire trajectory. And I mean, kind of, but I am making the exact same choices as people in New York. I'm making the same choices as those people, whether they are in, like somewhere else in the T20, T50, T whatever. We're all making those same choices, and we have a lot of choices to make even now that we are here in law school. And that is because as a 1L, you're choosing what electives can I take now that they're not making me take all of my classes specifically. You're also choosing where do I want to intern? What kind of internship do I want? What's even possible? And so it's just constant choices, and picking your law school was just the first choice, and it is not even necessarily that much of a defining choice. And finally, probably the reason that you came here, do I think my later applications, or at least not early applications, affected my cycle? Overall, I'm going to say no. And that is because when I turned in my applications, I was sure that while not perfect, they were the very best I could do. I had recs that I was sure were going to be good. I had given my best effort in my personal statements and things like that. So I don't think there was a huge impact. And in the end, I ended up where I wanted to be, where I feel like I was meant to be. I will say, though, with the tiniest caveat, that some schools are a lot more regimented in the way that they do things. So deadlines for scholarships are sooner. And so if your application isn't even in, even if it was something that you might have applied for or been, a potential recipient of, it's well too late by late December or definitely in January. Also, going back to the idea that some schools are more regimented, like if you don't meet this internal deadline of when your application is in, you're not going to meet this deadline for this interview. And if you don't get that interview, then you'll have to wait for the next one, and which means that you don't make that wave of acceptances or rejections or, waitlists, whatever. And so what I could see from schools like that, and in my own experience, was that you honestly, I wouldn't say like we're more likely to get rejected. It seemed almost like you were more likely to get waitlisted so that they could come back to you. But I really can't say. I didn't get a lot of waitlists. I didn't get a lot of rejections. I did have to wait a long time for a lot of answers, but worked out in the end. And honestly, I can't say even for the waitlist how they would have turned out, because I got into the school that I wanted to go to and was just like, bye. I'm not waiting this out for a school that I'm not going to say yes to. So on that note, I hope this was helpful. I hope that it helped put you at ease at least a little bit, because that is what I do. I will look on internet forums, on YouTube, vlogs, wherever I think somebody has talked about this, just to get an idea. And it's purely anecdotal. It's only based on my personal experience, but I hope that it at least makes you feel a little better, especially if you are a late applicant.